Welcome to Night Mind Psychosophy. Tonight we walk into the silence of Nietzsche. Enjoy.
Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small village of Raaken, in the Prussian province of Saxony. A quiet church village, surrounded by fields and autumn wind, and yet marked that very day by the birthday of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia. As if fate itself had already decided to write the boy into a story larger than his own. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was the village pastor, a devout Lutheran, carrying the weight of faith and duty. His mother, Franziska, a woman of discipline and silent resilience. Friedrich received his first name from the king himself, and with it, a symbolic burden he would carry for life. But the fragile security of childhood did not last. When Nietzsche was only 4 years old, tragedy struck. His father died after a painful brain illness. Soon after, Friedrich's younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, passed away at the age of 2. Within months, the family was shattered. What remained was a household ruled by women: his mother, his sister Elizabeth, his grandmother, and 2 aunts. It was a circle of quiet strength, but also of sorrow. The young boy grew up surrounded by silence, grief, and a watchful female presence. This atmosphere shaped him, sensitive, withdrawn, and already too close to death. In school, Nietzsche revealed himself as a mind apart. He was not only a diligent student, he was obsessive. He wrote poetry, composed music, and immersed himself in theology far beyond what was required. His teachers noticed, and thanks to his father's former state service, he was granted a scholarship to attend the prestigious boarding school of Schulpforta. Schulpforta was no ordinary school. Housed in the remnants of a medieval monastery, it was a training ground for Germany's intellectual elite. Nietzsche entered in 1858, and there he lived under strict discipline, days filled with Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and French. But his imagination ran far beyond textbooks. He devoured the poetry of Hölderlin, the romantic visions of Jean Paul, and the radical theology of David Strauss. He founded a student club called Germania, where he and his friends read literature, discussed music, and shared their own writings. Nietzsche wrote verses and piano pieces, already convinced that his life was set apart. At Schulpforta he also met Paul Deussen, who would later become a philosopher in his own right and an expert on Schopenhauer. Friendships formed in these years carried intellectual fire that would smolder for decades. When Nietzsche graduated in 1864, he was already restless. He had grown up within strict Lutheran piety, but the faith had begun to wither. Doubt gnawed at him. His notes reveal a young man who could not accept easy answers. He enrolled at the University of Bonn, officially to study theology and philology. But theology quickly collapsed for him. Within 1 semester he lost his childhood faith. He could no longer believe. In a letter to his devout sister Elizabeth, Nietzsche wrote words that would echo through history. If you want peace of soul and happiness, then believe. But if you want to be a devotee of truth, then seek. This was his first true manifesto. Truth over comfort. The search over the consolation of faith. In 1865, Nietzsche transferred to the University of Leipzig. There he deepened his studies under the philologist Friedrich Nietzsche, who soon praised him as a prodigy. But the real turning point came not in the classroom, but in a bookshop. Nietzsche discovered Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. The encounter was devastating. Schopenhauer described existence as blind striving, endless suffering, and Nietzsche felt his own inner struggles reflected on every page. He read the book obsessively. He wrote that it opened an abyss before him, but also a strange light. In Schopenhauer, Nietzsche found both a mirror and a rival. Shortly after, he encountered Friedrich Albert Lang's History of Materialism. It challenged science itself, its claims, its illusions, its hidden metaphysics. Nietzsche realized the modern world had stripped away the old gods, leaving a void that could not be ignored. By the time he was 24, Nietzsche had already published scholarly essays, impressed his professors, and been hailed as a phenomenon. His reputation was so great that, even without finishing his doctoral dissertation, he was offered a professorship at the University of Basel. The year was 1869. Nietzsche became one of the youngest professors in his field, a triumph, and yet also the beginning of a destiny that would lead him far beyond academia. And in Basel, his life would transform. There, he would meet Richard Wagner and enter a friendship of music, myth, and eventual betrayal. Nietzsche's childhood was not only marked by tragedy but also by a strange sense of distance from other children. His classmates remembered him as serious, often lost in thought, already carrying himself with the gravity of an adult. He did not thrive in games of strength or sport. He was delicate, plagued by poor eyesight, headaches, and a fragile body. Instead, he sought refuge in words and notes of music in the inner landscapes of imagination. At Schulpforta, this tendency deepened. The school itself had once been a monastery, and its corridors carried the echo of centuries. Students marched in strict routines, rising early, reciting lessons, living under rules that tested both discipline and endurance. Many boys buckled under the severity of the place, but Nietzsche seemed to absorb its atmosphere like fuel. He turned discipline into self-mastery, solitude into reflection. He discovered the poetry of Hölderlin, whose verses spoke of gods absent and longed for, and of a world torn between beauty and despair. Nietzsche later said that Hölderlin's poetry gave him both ecstasy and homesickness, a longing for something the modern world could no longer provide. He also encountered the radical theology of David Strauss, whose Life of Jesus stripped away the divine aura of Scripture and treated the Gospels as human documents. For Nietzsche, raised in the shadow of the church, this was explosive. He began to see faith not as revelation but as a story told to preserve power. Even as a teenager, he was already wrestling with questions that would define his life. What happens when the foundation of belief crumbles? What stands in its place? Nietzsche also turned to music. He composed small piano pieces, some imitating Beethoven, others reaching for Wagnerian drama before he had even met Wagner himself. He imagined himself not only as a thinker, but as an artist, someone whose task was to channel inner storms into creation. His friendships in these years reflected that same intensity. With Paul Deussen and other schoolmates, he formed a literary club where they read poetry aloud, debated philosophy, and dreamed of reshaping the world. Their group was small, obscure, yet it gave Nietzsche the first taste of what it meant to live as part of an intellectual brotherhood. These years forged the paradox of Nietzsche's character, a child raised in grief and silence, yet burning with an inner fire. By the time he entered university in Bonn, he already carried the outlines of the man he would become, solitary, uncompromising, and obsessed with the search for truth at any cost. In 1869, at the age of just 24, Friedrich Nietzsche was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. It was a meteoric rise, a young man still without a doctoral dissertation, suddenly placed among Europe's academic elite. Nietzsche himself confessed that he felt unworthy of such honor, but others already spoke of him as a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent. To accept the position, Nietzsche formally renounced his Prussian citizenship. He never applied for Swiss citizenship, and for the rest of his life, he remained stateless, a philosopher without a nation, untethered to any flag. Basel became his new home. The university was conservative, its professors steeped in the traditions of philology, history, and theology. But Nietzsche brought with him an intensity that soon set him apart. His lectures impressed students not just by their scholarship, but by their passion, by the sense that behind every analysis of Homer or Pindar, there pulsed a restless spirit searching for something beyond. More than anything, Basel placed Nietzsche in proximity to Richard Wagner. Wagner was, by then, already a cultural titan. In exile in Tripschen near Lake Lucerne, he lived with his partner Cosima, herself the daughter of the composer Franz Liszt. Wagner was over 30 years Nietzsche's senior, almost the same age as Nietzsche's deceased father. To the young professor, Wagner seemed both mentor and prophet. Their first meeting in 1868 had already struck Nietzsche like lightning. Now, living just hours apart, their friendship deepened. Nietzsche was a frequent guest in the Wagner household, spending evenings discussing philosophy, myth, and the destiny of German culture. He once described this friendship as the greatest fortune of my life. In Wagner's music, Nietzsche heard what he called the metaphysics of sound. It was art that reached beyond words, an intoxication of the spirit. Both men shared a devotion to Schopenhauer's philosophy, which elevated music as the purest expression of the world's inner will. Nietzsche, himself an amateur composer, felt as though he had found in Wagner a father figure and in Cosima a kindred spirit. But the outside world intruded. In 1870, war erupted between France and the newly ascended Prussia. Nietzsche, though stateless, volunteered as a medic at the front lines. He did not fight, but he carried wounded soldiers, tended to the sick, and endured the chaos of battlefields. Within weeks he contracted diphtheria and dysentery. The experience left him shattered, body broken, nerves frayed. He returned to Basel weakened, his health permanently compromised. The war's nationalistic frenzy disturbed him. While Germany celebrated victory and the proclamation of the new empire, Nietzsche felt himself alienated from patriotic triumph. His instincts were cosmopolitan, his loyalty not to empire or nation, but to the free spirit. In 1872, Nietzsche published his first book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. It was a daring work. Part philosophy, part philology, part personal confession. Nietzsche argued that Greek tragedy arose from the tension between two primal forces, the Apollonian, representing form, clarity, and restraint, and the Dionysian, embodying ecstasy, chaos, and primal vitality. Great art, he claimed, is born in the struggle between these forces. Through this lens, Nietzsche presented Wagner as the modern heir of Dionysus, the artist who might resurrect tragedy for the modern world. But the book scandalized the Academy. Traditional philologists ridiculed it. Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Mollendorf, a prominent scholar, published a scathing pamphlet denouncing Nietzsche's method as unscientific and reckless. To them, Nietzsche had betrayed philology by turning it into philosophy. Students adored him. The wider cultural world took notice. But within academia, Nietzsche's position became precarious. He himself later admitted that the book was almost unreadable to anyone not already immersed in Kant and Schopenhauer. Still, it was a first step into the role he would soon claim fully, not a philologist, but a philosopher, a cultural physician diagnosing the sickness of his age. The years that followed were restless. Between 1873 and 1876, Nietzsche wrote a series of essays known as Untimely Meditations. In these essays, he lashed out at what he saw as the decadence of contemporary German culture. He criticized the shallow piety of the theologian David Strauss, attacked the way history was worshipped as an idol rather than used for life, and praised Schopenhauer as a model of integrity. One essay, written in 1876, exalted Wagner as a cultural savior. At this time, Nietzsche still believed Wagner might be the figure to redeem European culture from mediocrity. But doubts were creeping in. The turning point came at Bayreuth. In 1876, Wagner unveiled his long-awaited festival, the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, a theater built solely for his operas. For Nietzsche, who had dreamed of this moment, it should have been a triumph. Instead, it was a shock. The festival, meant to embody Dionysian art, seemed to Nietzsche a nationalistic pageant, a shallow spectacle. The crowd was filled with nobility, dignitaries, and admirers eager to bask in Wagner's glory. Nietzsche saw not the rebirth of tragedy, but the corruption of it, art serving applause and patriotism. He left disillusioned. Later that year, Nietzsche traveled to Sorrento in Italy with friends Paul Rie and Malwida von Meysenbug. There, surrounded by the calm of the Mediterranean, he began to distance himself from Wagner's spell. He still admired Wagner's genius, but he saw with new clarity the dangers of idolatry. Wagner was not a savior. He was an artist, flawed and compromised by ambition. Nietzsche did not attend the premiere of Wagner's opera Parsifal in 1877. The once radiant friendship had begun to cool. The Basel years had given Nietzsche prestige, friendship, and his first book. They had also given him conflict, illness, and disappointment. He was now a man caught between two worlds, the academic world that doubted him, and the artistic world that threatened to consume him. He had begun as a philologist. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a philosopher intent on overturning the very foundations of culture. And soon, that transformation would demand a price. Nietzsche's professorship at Basel was not only a professional triumph, but also a heavy burden. He was younger than many of his students, and the older faculty often regarded him with suspicion. His lectures were brilliant but demanding, filled with long passages of Greek and sudden leaps into philosophy. Some students adored him, others found him overwhelming. Already, the tension between academic convention and Nietzsche's restless spirit was visible. His bond with Wagner grew more intense during these years. He visited Tripschen so often that friends joked he was part of the household. Evenings at the Wagners were a strange theater of philosophy, music, and myth. Cosima recorded in her diary how Nietzsche spoke with almost prophetic fervor, praising Wagner as a figure who might redeem the German spirit. Wagner, in turn, called Nietzsche the most gifted of all our friends. Yet beneath the warmth, cracks were forming. Nietzsche began to sense Wagner's hunger for recognition, his desire for the adoration of crowds and the favor of emperors. Wagner's charisma was undeniable, but Nietzsche wondered, was this truly the rebirth of Dionysus, or was it another form of vanity disguised as art? The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 sharpened this unease. Nietzsche's volunteer service as a medic left him sickened not only in body but also in spirit. He had carried soldiers dying of dysentery, seen the grotesque wounds of battle, smelled the stench of infection. The nationalistic celebrations that followed Germany's victory rang hollow to him. When his colleagues at Basel joined the patriotic chorus, Nietzsche stood apart, quietly alienated. The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, was both his offering and his challenge to the world. He insisted that life could only be justified as an aesthetic phenomenon, that the clash between Apollo and Dionysus was the secret pulse of culture. Critics scoffed, but a few readers felt the shock of recognition. The book was not scholarship in the old sense, it was philosophy in disguise, a manifesto smuggled into philology. When Nietzsche released his untimely meditations in the years that followed, the distance between him and the academic establishment grew wider. He denounced the obsession with historical knowledge that, in his view, crushed the vitality of life. He warned that culture had become sterile, drowning in facts but starving for meaning. His colleagues muttered about arrogance, about a young man who thought himself wiser than tradition. But Nietzsche pressed on, convinced he was diagnosing a sickness no one else dared to name. By the time of the Bayreuth Festival in 1876, Nietzsche was exhausted, physically ill, and spiritually divided. The spectacle of Wagner's triumph, the cheering crowds and the pomp of nationalism, confirmed his darkest fears. He wrote afterward that he had seen behind the mask, and what he saw was not Dionysus, but decadence dressed in myth. This realization marked the beginning of the end. The friendship with Wagner, once the great anchor of his life, would never recover its former glow. Nietzsche left Bayreuth disenchanted, and in Italy he began to imagine a new path, one that would lead him away from idols and toward solitude. By the late 1870s, Nietzsche stood at a crossroads. His health was in ruins, migraines, stomach pains, and failing eyesight haunted him. His lectures at Basel were often interrupted, sometimes canceled entirely. And yet, the greater collapse was not physical, but spiritual. His devotion to Richard Wagner, once the brightest star of his life, had begun to fracture. What had started as admiration was turning into disappointment, then disillusion. In 1878, Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human. It marked the beginning of an entirely new phase in his thought. Gone was the Wagnerian tone, the Schopenhauerian gloom, the longing for redemptive art. In their place appeared aphorisms, hundreds of sharp, precise fragments that cut into morality, religion, and culture with surgical clarity. He dedicated the book to the memory of Voltaire, and with that dedication declared his allegiance to the Enlightenment rather than to myth. Nietzsche was breaking with the world he once revered. Human, All Too Human was, in many ways, the book that severed his friendship with Wagner. Within its pages, Nietzsche sketched caricatures of the artist as priest, the genius who seduces followers with false promises of transcendence. Wagner saw himself in those lines, and he was not mistaken. Cosima Wagner, once his confidant, wrote bitterly in her diary that Nietzsche had betrayed them. The Wagner circle, once his family, turned hostile. The rupture was complete. For Nietzsche, the break was painful but necessary. He wrote in his notes, "I must learn to stand alone." His health forced him to resign his professorship at Basel in 1879. At only 34 years old, he gave up the security of a career and an income. From then on, Nietzsche lived as a wanderer, stateless, rootless, supported by a modest pension and whatever he could earn from writing. He spent summers in the alpine air of Sils Maria in Switzerland, winters in Italy or the French Riviera. Genoa, Nice, Venice, Rapallo, each place became a temporary refuge. He sought climates that would ease his pain, but no place offered real relief. His letters from this period reveal a man oscillating between despair and fierce determination. He confessed to friends that he felt isolated, yet he also proclaimed that his suffering was the crucible from which a new philosophy would be born. In 1881, he published Daybreak, another collection of aphorisms. In it, he attacked the foundations of morality, calling for a radical revaluation of values. He argued that what we call morality was not divine truth, but a human invention, a system grown out of fear, weakness, and the need for control. The book sold poorly. Few understood what Nietzsche was attempting. But to him, it was a breakthrough, the beginning of a philosophy free of Schopenhauer, free of Wagner, free of all idols. That same year, while walking near Lake Silvaplana in Sils Maria, Nietzsche experienced what he later described as a revelation. Beneath a great pyramidal rock, he conceived the thought of eternal recurrence, the idea that all events in life will return, endlessly repeated through infinite time. Would you embrace your life if you knew it would repeat forever? Or would you curse it? To Nietzsche, this thought was the ultimate test of affirmation. He wrote, "The heaviest weight is placed upon you, to live as though each moment must return eternally." In 1882, Nietzsche published The Gay Science, a book that brought together aphorism, poetry, and song. It was in this work that he first declared the words that would echo through the modern world, "God is dead." This was not a triumphant cry of atheism, but a diagnosis. The old faith, the Christian worldview that had given Europe its values for centuries, was crumbling. Science, history, and philosophy had eroded its foundations. What remained was a void, nihilism, the sense that life no longer carried inherent meaning. Nietzsche did not celebrate this death. He feared it. For when God is dead, all absolute values die with him. Humanity faces the abyss of meaninglessness. And yet, he also saw in this crisis an opportunity, the chance to create new values, born not from heaven but from human strength. Amid these intellectual storms, Nietzsche's personal life reached a breaking point. In Rome, in the spring of 1882, he met Lou Andreas-Salomé. She was brilliant, only 21 years old, fiercely independent, with a mind as sharp as his own. Nietzsche was captivated. He imagined with her, and with their friend Paul Riesz, a small intellectual commune in the Alps, a life of shared thought, free of convention. But Nietzsche's feelings for Lou went beyond philosophy. He proposed marriage to her more than once. She declined. To her, Nietzsche was a teacher, not a lover. Her bond with Paul Riesz deepened, and Nietzsche felt abandoned. The episode devastated him. His letters from that summer burned with heartbreak and anger. He accused Lou of betrayal, and he turned against his sister Elizabeth, whom he suspected of manipulating the situation behind his back. The trio, Nietzsche, Lou, and Riesz, dissolved in bitterness. Nietzsche was left alone once again, sick, wounded, and more isolated than ever. And yet, from this loneliness, his philosophy hardened. He wrote to a friend, "I will one day give humanity something it has never seen." By the early 1880s, Nietzsche had broken with Wagner, abandoned his professorship, lost love, and embraced the role of a solitary philosopher. He had begun to chart the course toward his greatest work, a prophetic book that would carry his voice into eternity. Soon, in the quiet mountains of Sils Maria, Nietzsche would give birth to Zarathustra. Nietzsche's retreat into solitude during these years was not merely the story of a man escaping society. It was a deliberate self-experiment. He tested how far a mind could go when stripped of belonging, when freed from the obligations of institutions, friendships, and even love. Letters from Sils Maria reveal him as both fragile and unyielding. He wrote of his agonizing headaches, his vomiting fits, his temporary blindness, and then, in the same breath, of visions that seemed to erupt from the mountains themselves. Here, he wrote, I feel closer to eternity. He called himself a tempter of fate, as though his own suffering were a form of philosophical training. Every migraine became a test of endurance, every broken friendship a lesson in detachment. Out of this crucible, he sharpened his thought into weapons of aphorism, sentences so condensed that they struck like lightning bolts. During this same period, he began filling notebooks with reflections on culture, psychology, and morality. Many of these fragments would not see publication until after his death, but they show how far he was moving from the shadow of Wagner. Where once he believed redemption would come through art, he now saw redemption only in self-overcoming and tearing down false idols, one by one. Even his style was changing. The long essays of his early career gave way to quick strikes, razor-edged insights that required no justification. His philosophy was becoming not an argument, but a performance, a demonstration of what it meant to think without gods, without masters. For Nietzsche, truth was not something to be discovered, like a hidden treasure waiting beneath the earth. Truth was created, shaped, forced into existence by the strength of one's perspective. This radical insight, still only half-formed in the late 1870s, would soon erupt into his central doctrines. The break with Wagner was not simply personal. It was symbolic, the rejection of all surrogate fathers, all saviors, all promises of final redemption. Nietzsche would no longer kneel before anyone's vision, not Wagner's, not Schopenhauer's, not Christianity's. He would stand alone, and in that solitude, forge the language of Zarathustra. The solitude into which Nietzsche entered after his break with Wagner was not only physical but also intellectual. He began to see himself as a free spirit, one of the few willing to abandon the comfort of inherited beliefs. In his notebooks, he described this figure as someone who does not seek shelter in old faiths, nor in new idols, but dares the open sea. These years were his apprenticeship in freedom. He experimented with new forms of writing, fragments, parables, lightning flashes of thought that often ended in questions rather than answers. His books sold poorly, sometimes only a few hundred copies, but he seemed less and less concerned with audience. He wrote as if for the future, convinced that the present could not yet hear him. His style shocked readers. In Daybreak and the Gay Science, he dismantled morality by asking where it had come from, not what it claimed to be, but what human needs had created it. He treated values as symptoms, as masks concealing deeper instincts. Every sentence seemed to ask, who benefits from this belief? Who gains power from this truth? This way of thinking was unprecedented. Most philosophers had written in the language of systems and proofs. Nietzsche wrote in the language of suspicion, as if every lofty claim was a disguise. He was creating what later generations would call a genealogy of morality, the tracing of ideas back to their hidden origins in fear, resentment, or desire. But these insights came at a cost. Nietzsche's isolation deepened. His letters from this time are filled with a mixture of icy clarity and aching loneliness. I am writing for ears that do not yet exist, he confessed. The rejection of Wagner, the cold reception of his books, and the collapse of his hopes with Lou Andreas-Salomé left him more alone than ever. And yet, in that isolation, he found a voice unlike any other. A voice that would soon speak in the mask of a prophet, delivering words that would echo through eternity. In the winter of 1882, in the silence of the Engadin Mountains of Switzerland, Nietzsche felt a storm rising inside him. He was 38 years old, his health still fragile, his friendships shattered, his reputation uncertain. Yet in solitude he felt possessed by something greater than himself, a voice, a vision, a figure that would soon speak through him. That figure was Zarathustra. In February 1883, in a burst of inspiration lasting only 10 days, Nietzsche wrote the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He described the experience as though a flood had broken through his soul. The words came not as arguments but as revelations, carried by rhythm, metaphor, and parable. He called it his gift to mankind. Zarathustra was not a philosopher in the ordinary sense. He was a prophet, a mask through which Nietzsche announced his boldest ideas. The book spoke of the death of God, the coming of the Übermensch, and the eternal recurrence of all things. Its style was biblical, poetic, almost liturgical. It was a philosophy that demanded not only to be read, but to be heard, to be felt. The message of Zarathustra was unlike anything written before. The Übermensch, the Overman, was Nietzsche's response to the crisis of nihilism. If God was dead, if the old values had collapsed, then humanity faced a choice: either sink into despair or create new values with its own strength. The Übermensch symbolized this higher type of human being, one who could say yes to life, one who could shape meaning instead of waiting for it. Nietzsche wrote, "Man is something that shall be overcome." What have you done to overcome him? For him, humanity was not the end point of evolution, but a bridge, a rope stretched between beast and creator. Alongside this vision came the thought of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche framed it as a challenge. What if every moment of your life had to return, endlessly, exactly as it has been lived? Could you embrace it? Could you say yes, even to suffering, even to loss? To affirm eternal recurrence was to affirm life itself, not just its pleasures, but its pain. These doctrines, the Übermensch, the eternal return, the death of God, formed a triad of ideas that would echo through philosophy, literature, and psychology for generations. Yet in his own time, they bewildered readers. Zarathustra sold poorly, many copies going unsold. Friends found the book incomprehensible. To the academic world, it seemed the ravings of a mad prophet. But Nietzsche himself believed it to be his masterpiece. He wrote, "This book is not only the greatest I have ever written, it is the deepest book humanity possesses." The 4 parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra were published between 1883 and 1885. Each expanded the myth of the prophet who descends from the mountains to speak to humanity. The tone shifted between exaltation and despair, between visions of glory and dark satire of mankind's weakness. It was a scripture for a new age, though few recognized it as such. After Zarathustra, Nietzsche turned to works written in a sharper, more analytical style. In 1886, he published Beyond Good and Evil. Here, he tore into the assumptions of Western philosophy itself. He argued that philosophers had always disguised their prejudices as eternal truths, when in fact they were expressions of hidden drives. "There are no facts, only interpretations," he declared. Every claim to truth was a mask for the will to power. Nietzsche now called openly for a revaluation of all values. Christian morality, with its exaltation of humility, meekness, and self-denial, he saw as the product of weakness, what he named slave morality. In contrast, the morality of the strong, the noble, the creators of values, had been buried under centuries of resentment. The task of the future was to break free, to rediscover the power to affirm life, to say yes without apology. The following year, 1887, he deepened these ideas in On the Genealogy of Morality. This book, composed of 3 searing essays, dissected the history of moral concepts. He traced how the proud values of the strong had been inverted by the weak, how good had once meant noble and powerful, but came to mean humble, meek, and obedient. He revealed how guilt and punishment grew out of debt, how ascetic ideals were used to control, and how resentment poisoned the soul of Europe. It was in this book that Nietzsche introduced one of his most enduring contrasts, master morality and slave morality. Masters created values out of overflowing strength. Slaves created values out of resentment, defining good only in opposition to what they feared. For Nietzsche, this inversion of values was the root of Europe's spiritual sickness. He also found inspiration in unexpected places. Around this time, he discovered the novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Nietzsche called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn. In Dostoevsky's characters, he saw the same struggles he was analyzing: guilt, will, freedom, and the abyss of despair. It was as if literature and philosophy were converging in the same dark terrain. Nietzsche's personal life in these years was as solitary as ever. His health remained fragile, his friendships few. Only a handful of confidants remained: Peter Gast, his devoted disciple who helped him with proofreading, and a few scattered correspondents who admired his courage. His sister Elizabeth had married the fanatic nationalist Bernhard Forster and moved to Paraguay to start an Aryan colony, a project Nietzsche despised. Their relationship soured to the point of near hostility. Yet even in isolation, Nietzsche felt a rising sense of destiny. He wrote more feverishly than ever, as though time were running out. In letters, he spoke of his work as lightning and dynamite. In his notebooks, he described himself as a hammer, not to destroy for destruction's sake, but to test idols, to strike them and hear if they rang hollow. By 1888, his energy surged in a final blaze. That year, he would write book after book, each more daring, more incendiary than the last. But before that final burst, Zarathustra and the works that followed had already transformed philosophy. Nietzsche had given voice to ideas that would haunt the 20th century: the collapse of certainty, the suspicion of truth, the challenge of creating meaning in a godless world. He had written for readers not yet born. And though the world ignored him, he believed his time would come. Nietzsche often described the writing of Zarathustra as if it were a possession. He told friends that he did not compose the book, but that it came to him like a storm, as though another voice spoke through him. In his notebooks, he confessed that entire passages arrived fully formed, written in a single sitting, accompanied by a kind of trance. This sense of inspiration gave the work its prophetic tone, not a system of thought, but a vision delivered from the heights of solitude. The imagery of Zarathustra reflected this inspiration. Mountains, animals, deserts, and stars filled its pages, symbols drawn from Nietzsche's own wanderings. The eagle and the serpent, companions of Zarathustra, embodied pride and wisdom united. The image of the tightrope walker, falling to his death before the prophet's eyes, captured the fragile state of humanity, balanced between what it had been and what it might become. Many readers dismissed these symbols as madness, but for Nietzsche they were more real than logic. He believed that philosophy had to speak to the imagination as well as the intellect, that only symbols could carry the weight of the death of God. Yet even as he wrote, Nietzsche knew his work was misunderstood. He gave away copies of Zarathustra to friends, only to hear silence in return. One friend returned the book unopened. Critics ignored it. To the culture of the 1880s, the idea of the Übermensch or eternal recurrence was incomprehensible. Nietzsche joked bitterly, "I am not read, I am not heard, but someday my time will come." This sense of writing for the future deepened his isolation. He once said that he was building a philosophical catacomb, a place where his ideas would lie in wait until some future generation unearthed them. He was not simply writing books, he was burying treasures in the earth of time. His work Beyond Good and Evil sharpened the blade of Zarathustra. In it, he attacked the dogmatism of past philosophers, accusing them of dressing up personal prejudices as eternal truths. He challenged the assumption that truth could ever be neutral. Instead, he wrote, truth was inseparable from perspective, from the will of those who claimed it. Every claim to objectivity masked a hidden desire for control. This suspicion of truth was radical. It meant that philosophy itself had to be questioned, that no system could claim final authority. Instead of certainty, Nietzsche offered an open battlefield of perspectives, each struggling for expression. He called this struggle the will to power, not a political will to dominate others, but the deeper drive of all life to expand, to assert, to create. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche carried this method to its limit. He dissected the very words by which Europe judged good and evil. He showed how good once meant noble, strong, life-affirming, while bad referred simply to the low or common. Over time, resentment turned these meanings upside down. The powerless, unable to act, defined the powerful as evil and themselves as good. This inversion, Nietzsche argued, gave rise to Christian morality, a system built on denial, guilt, and revenge disguised as love. He did not present this history coldly. His tone was urgent, almost surgical, as though he were cutting into the flesh of European culture to expose its hidden disease. He warned that unless these values were revalued, Europe faced decline. During these years, Nietzsche also reflected on art, literature, and science with the same ferocity. He attacked the complacency of German nationalism, the pretensions of academic scholarship, the growing cult of pessimism in culture. At the same time, he praised writers who confronted the depths of the human soul. When he read Dostoevsky, he declared, "He is the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn." In Dostoevsky's characters, he recognized the same struggles with guilt, freedom, and nihilism that haunted his own philosophy. Nietzsche's notebooks from the mid-1880s reveal a man both exhausted and exhilarated. His health continued to decline, yet his creativity burned hotter than ever. He spoke of himself as a volcano, storing energy for a final eruption. He began sketching ideas for a massive work he called The Will to Power, a book that was never finished in his lifetime but that he imagined as the culmination of all his thought. And all the while, Zarathustra remained at the center. He returned again and again to the figure of the prophet, the teacher who descends to humanity only to find himself rejected. Nietzsche knew he was writing his own fate. Like Zarathustra, he would not be understood in his time. But he believed he was preparing humanity for a new epoch, one where the death of God would no longer be tragedy, but liberation. Nietzsche's vision of philosophy in these years became inseparable from his vision of the philosopher himself. He no longer believed in detached, academic thinkers scribbling footnotes to Plato. For him, a philosopher was a creator, a risk-taker, even a destroyer, someone who lived their thought with blood and nerve, someone who put their entire existence on trial. He wrote that the true philosopher must be the man of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, one who anticipates the future and suffers for it in the present. He saw himself in that description. His isolation, his poverty, his constant illness, these were not accidents, but part of the price of truth. Philosophy, he believed, was not a career but a destiny. This conviction explains the tone of his late works. And beyond good and evil and on the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche's voice no longer pleads or persuades. It commands, mocks, ridicules, warns. He spoke as if shaking his readers awake, telling them that the age of comfortable illusions was over. He imagined the future in stark terms: either humanity would sink deeper into mediocrity, into the last man who desires only comfort and safety, or it would rise toward the Overman, the creator of new values. Between these two possibilities stretched the tension of modern life. Even his metaphors grew sharper. He called himself dynamite, a force meant to shatter the old foundations. He compared his books to hammers striking idols to hear whether they rang hollow. For him, destruction was never an end in itself, but a test, a way of clearing space for creation. In letters he hinted at the storm that was gathering. "The next years will decide," he wrote, "whether Europe has a future or whether it will collapse under its own values." It was not only a philosophical statement but a prophecy, one he believed he had been chosen to deliver. As the decade drew to a close, Nietzsche stood on the threshold of both triumph and disaster. The works he had written between 1883 and 1887 had set the stage. What came next would be an explosion, a swan song that would burn with brilliance before silence fell forever. The year 1888 was the final blaze of Friedrich Nietzsche's creative life. It has been called his annus mirabilis, his miraculous year, and also his annus horribilis, his terrible year. For in this brief span of months, Nietzsche produced some of the most daring works in modern philosophy, and then collapsed forever into silence. He was 43 years old. His health, long fragile, seemed strangely stable that year. He spoke of feeling clarity, energy, almost euphoria. His letters brimmed with confidence. To friends he declared that he was finally speaking with his true voice. To himself he confessed that he was writing as if time were running out. What followed was a torrent. One book after another, each like a thunderclap. First came the case of Wagner, a ferocious pamphlet published early in 1888. In it, Nietzsche tore apart the man he had once adored. Wagner, he claimed, was no prophet of Dionysus but a decadent, a manipulator of instincts, a master of cheap seduction. His music, Nietzsche wrote, sickened the body and weakened the will. This attack shocked readers who remembered Nietzsche as Wagner's champion. But to Nietzsche, it was not betrayal, it was honesty. Wagner had become, for him, the very symbol of decline, the artist who pretends to offer transcendence while dragging humanity deeper into weakness. By summer, Nietzsche was working at fever pitch. In only a few weeks, he composed Twilight of the Idols. He subtitled it How to Philosophize with a Hammer. The book was a condensed explosion of his thought, aphorisms that struck at the foundations of European culture. He mocked Socrates as a symptom of decay, accused morality of being hostility to life, attacked Christianity as a denial of strength. He even ridiculed German nationalism, calling it petty and vulgar. In these pages, Nietzsche's style was sharp, almost playful in its cruelty. Every line was a hammer blow. One of its most famous passages reads, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." In those words, Nietzsche captured the essence of his philosophy, the belief that life's meaning is found not in avoiding suffering, but in transforming it. Yet he was not finished. Almost immediately after Twilight of the Idols, he wrote The Antichrist. This was no gentle critique. It was a declaration of war. Christianity, he wrote, is the greatest curse that has ever been laid upon mankind. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche unleashed his rage against the morality of pity, humility, and weakness. He saw Christianity not as a source of love, but as a conspiracy of the weak to shackle the strong. He accused it of poisoning life itself. The Christian church, he wrote, has left nothing untouched by its corruption. It has turned every value into its opposite. Even sympathetic readers recoiled. The book was too violent, too absolute. Nietzsche himself called it a bomb that should explode in the heart of Europe. But the most revealing work of 1888 was Ecce Homo. It was meant to be his intellectual autobiography, his account of why he had lived and written as he did. Its chapter titles astonished readers: Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books. At first glance, these titles seem arrogant, even absurd. But within them lay irony, playfulness, and also desperation. Nietzsche wanted to explain himself before it was too late. He reviewed each of his earlier works, praised his own courage, mocked his critics, and cast himself as a figure of destiny. In Ecce Homo he wrote, "I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with something tremendous, a crisis like no other on earth." He believed he was not only a philosopher but a force that would split history in two. Throughout 1888, Nietzsche's letters grew stranger, more intense. He signed them with names like Dionysus or the Crucified. He declared himself both destroyer and savior, hammer and lightning. To some correspondents, his words sounded prophetic. To others, they sounded like madness. Yet there was method in his fire. The works of 1888 were not random delirium. They were the culmination of his entire project: the death of God, the revaluation of values, the affirmation of life, the vision of the Overman. In them, he distilled his philosophy into its sharpest form. But behind the brilliance, the collapse was near. Friends noticed his agitation, his insomnia, his bursts of energy that bordered on mania. Nietzsche himself seemed to sense it. In his notes he wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." He knew he was burning at a dangerous intensity. The swan song of 1888 was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because Nietzsche had at last spoken in his full voice, without disguise or compromise. Tragedy, because that voice was about to fall silent. By the end of the year, he had written The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and fragments for another book, Nietzsche contra Wagner. No other philosopher had produced so much, so fiercely, in so short a time. It was as if he knew he had only months left before darkness descended. In January 1889, the darkness came. Nietzsche's final year was marked not only by speed but by intensity of vision. He no longer wrote as a man trying to persuade, he wrote as if he were pronouncing verdicts. Every sentence carried the weight of judgment, as if he were hammering commandments onto the future. In Twilight of the Idols, he reduced his philosophy to concentrated flashes. To live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering. I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. The will to a system is a lack of integrity. These were not arguments, they were weapons, aphorisms sharpened to pierce. In The Antichrist, his fury reached its most extreme. Nietzsche attacked the figure of Christ himself, not with hatred for the man, but with contempt for what had been built in his name. To Nietzsche, the Jesus of the Gospels represented innocence and strength, but Christianity had inverted him into weakness and pity. He called priests the most poisonous kind of parasite and claimed they had drained Europe of its vitality. The book was so violent in tone that Nietzsche's publisher hesitated to release it. It would remain unpublished until after his collapse. But Nietzsche wrote it with the conviction of a prophet, as if he were cutting open the heart of Western civilization to expose its corruption. Ecce Homo revealed the other side of this intensity. Here, Nietzsche looked back on his own life with irony and theatrical pride. He described how each of his books had been milestones in a grand journey, steps toward the revelation of Zarathustra. "I know my fate," he wrote. "One day my name will be remembered with something tremendous, with a crisis like no other." These words sound arrogant, but they were also prophecy. Nietzsche sensed that his philosophy was not for his own century, but for those yet to come. He believed he was planting charges beneath the foundations of morality, charges that would not detonate until long after his death. Even the tone of Ecce Homo wavered between jest and despair. He mocked himself, calling his own wisdom excessive, but between the lines there is urgency, the desperation of a man who knows he is running out of time. The fever of 1888 cannot be understood without the sense of euphoria that accompanied it. Nietzsche wrote that he felt lighter, clearer, as if his sickness had lifted. In reality, the energy may have been the final surge before collapse, the manic brightness of a mind on the edge. But he embraced it. In a single month he could write what others produced in a decade. He referred to his books as my morning, my harvest, my lightning bolts. He told friends that history would be divided into two halves, before him and after him. Such claims sound delusional, and perhaps they were, but they also captured the intensity of what he had achieved. No philosopher before him had spoken with such ferocity. His voice was not the calm of the lecture hall, but the storm of a prophet who had torn away every illusion. He was not asking Europe to consider new ideas. He was demanding that it face a new reality, a world without God, without absolutes, where only the strength to create values could prevent collapse into nihilism. In these last works, Nietzsche presented himself not only as a thinker but as a threshold. He was the one who announced the end of the old world and the beginning of something unknown. Whether humanity would rise to meet it or sink into decadence was not his to decide. His task was only to declare the crisis, to strike the hammer against the idols, and to wait for the echo. 1888 was his final blaze. Within months, his mind would break. But in this year, in this fever, he gave the world a legacy that still burns, dangerous, dazzling, unfinished. Nietzsche's eruption in 1888 was not only a series of books. It was a campaign, an assault on the very foundations of European thought. Each work was like a different weapon in his arsenal, aimed at a different idol. In the case of Wagner, he dismantled the illusion of art as salvation. In Twilight of the Idols, he struck at philosophy itself, mocking its great names, overturning its certainties. In The Antichrist, he declared war on Christianity. In Ecce Homo, he placed himself at the center of the storm, proclaiming that he was both the destroyer and the prophet of renewal. Read together, these works form a single vision. Europe was sick, poisoned by false values, and Nietzsche was its physician. His method was diagnosis by hammer blows. He tested beliefs as one tests idols, by striking them, to hear if they rang hollow. What is remarkable is not only what he destroyed, but what he offered in its place. He did not leave only ruins. Again and again, he returned to the theme of affirmation, the yes to life, even in suffering. Amor fati, he called it, the love of fate. To embrace one's life so completely that even pain, failure, and loss could be welcomed. To live as if each moment deserved eternity. This affirmation was the heart of his final year. In Ecce Homo, he described his philosophy as a dance, as laughter rising even in the face of tragedy. He declared, "I am, by nature, warlike. Attacking is part of my joy. But I attack as a creator. I only attack things that claim to be eternal. Where I find ruin, I build new life." Such passages reveal the paradox of Nietzsche's late thought, ferocious in destruction, but always aiming at rebirth. His hammer was not only a weapon, it was a tool for clearing the ground. But the price of such intensity was heavy. Friends who saw him in 1888 noticed the strangeness in his eyes, the way his speech would race, his laughter erupt unexpectedly. He seemed filled with power, but also haunted, as if carrying a burden too great for one mind. His letters show the same duality. Some are brilliant, witty, full of playful irony. Others slip into mania, signed with names like the Crucified or Dionysus. He sent notes to strangers, to kings, to musicians, proclaiming himself a world historical figure. Even as the books poured from his pen, madness was approaching. Yet Nietzsche himself embraced the danger. He wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." It was both defiance and prophecy. He knew he was burning at the edge of collapse, but he accepted it as part of his fate. 1888 was therefore not just a swan song, it was an explosion that left the intellectual landscape forever changed. No other philosopher had ended a career with such violence, such clarity, such fire. In a single year, Nietzsche had written himself into immortality. But immortality demanded a sacrifice. In the first days of the new year, the price would be paid. On the morning of January 3, 1889, in the city of Turin, Friedrich Nietzsche walked into legend. According to the story, he stepped into a square and saw a horse being whipped by its driver. Moved by sudden compassion, Nietzsche rushed forward, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and broke into tears. Moments later, he collapsed to the ground. Whether every detail is true or not, what is certain is this: that day marked the end of Nietzsche's conscious life. He was 44 years old. The philosopher who had written of strength, solitude, and affirmation was struck down by madness. After the collapse, Nietzsche began writing what later became known as the Warnbrief, the Letters of Madness. These letters, sent to friends, colleagues, even kings, were filled with strange proclamations. He signed them with names like the Crucified, Dionysus, or Caesar. He declared himself both destroyer and savior, conqueror and redeemer. To one friend he wrote, "Sing me a new song, the world is transfigured and all the heavens rejoice." To another, he claimed, "I am Prado, I am also Jesus, I have been shot by criminals in the name of the law." These fragments were not philosophy, but the echo of a mind unraveling. Friends rushed to help. The musician Peter Gast, his faithful companion, traveled to Turin. Nietzsche was taken first to Basel, then to a clinic in Jena. Doctors diagnosed tertiary syphilis, the standard explanation of the time. Later scholars have questioned this, suggesting strokes, brain tumors, or genetic illness. The truth remains uncertain. What is clear is that Nietzsche's body had long been failing, and his mind, pushed to the breaking point, finally gave way. From 1889 onward, Nietzsche would never recover. For the last 11 years of his life, he lived in silence, dependent on the care of others. In 1890, his mother Francisca brought him back to her home in Naumburg. She nursed him with patience, protecting him from the eyes of a curious world. Nietzsche, once the solitary wanderer of Europe, now sat quietly in a chair, sometimes humming, sometimes staring into space. He was no longer the man who had written Zarathustra. Visitors described him as vacant, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes agitated. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words made little sense. The fire of his thought had been extinguished, leaving only the shell of the man. In 1897, Francisca died. Nietzsche, unable to understand, was placed under the care of his sister Elizabeth. She took him to Weimar, where she established the Nietzsche Archive, a place that was part shrine, part institution, part museum. Here, in Villa Silberblick, Elizabeth displayed her brother like a relic. Visitors, writers, artists, curious admirers were invited to see him, the broken genius sitting silently, his great mustache still intact, his eyes distant. Some wept at the sight, others felt unease. It was as if they were witnessing both greatness and tragedy embodied in one man. Elizabeth managed her brother's legacy with determination, but also distortion. She edited his unpublished notes, arranging them into a book called The Will to Power. But she altered, omitted, and rearranged the material, bending it to her own nationalist and anti-Semitic sympathies, ideas Nietzsche himself had despised. This manipulation caused great confusion for decades. Readers encountered a Nietzsche who seemed to support ideologies he would have loathed. Only later would scholars set the record straight, uncovering his true voice beneath Elizabeth's revisions. Still, during his final silent years, Nietzsche himself remained beyond all distortion. He was no longer a writer, no longer a philosopher, no longer even fully present. He was an icon and a suffering human being. By the late 1890s, Nietzsche's body also began to fail. Strokes left him partially paralyzed. He could no longer walk steadily, could no longer care for himself. Yet still he lived, carried along by the devotion of family and the curiosity of a world that was just beginning to recognize his genius. On August 25, 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche died in Weimar at the age of 55. The cause was reported as pneumonia, complicated by his weakened state and a final stroke. He was buried in his hometown of Aachen, next to the grave of his father, the pastor who had died when Nietzsche was only a child. Thus ended the life of a man who had never fit his time. He began as a prodigy, became a prophet, and died as a shadow. His last words were not recorded, for he no longer had words to give. His last act was silence. And yet, that silence was not the end. Nietzsche's books, neglected during his lifetime, would soon find readers across Europe. His name, once dismissed, would become a spark that ignited movements, inspired artists, provoked philosophers, and haunted the 20th century. The man who fell in Turin lived on, not in body, but in the dynamite of his ideas. The story of the horse in Turin is a legend, and yet, like many legends, it reveals a truth beyond facts. Nietzsche spent his life arguing against pity as a hidden form of resentment, a morality that weakens. But in the square that morning, if the story is to be believed, pity tore through him as a final lightning strike. The philosopher who demanded hardness embraced a suffering animal and shattered. Even if the details are uncertain, the symbol endures, genius breaking where it is most human. After the collapse, time lost its form. Nietzsche's notes dissolved into fragments, his letters became cries. He wrote to friends and strangers with the same voice, exalted, wild, luminous, detached from the thread of ordinary life. Some sentences were like hymns, others were incoherent, a collage of identities and visions. The mind that had cut through Europe's values with a scalpel now moved as if in a storm with no shore. Hospitals followed. A room, a window, the white of sheets, the measured steps of attendants. He had once described himself as a volcano, now the mountain was silent while smoke still curled from its peak. Diagnoses multiplied. Explanations tried to catch what had already fallen. Tertiary syphilis was the name physicians used, but the underlying drama exceeded labels. What had broken in Turin was not just a brain, it was a tempo of life no body could sustain. In Naumburg, his mother's house became a sanctuary against spectacle. Franziska guarded him with a practical tenderness, food, warmth, quiet, a human presence that required nothing in return. Visitors were discouraged. The few who were admitted saw a figure seated by a window or resting in bed, occasionally humming a phrase that might once have been a melody. The famous mustache remained, like a signature left behind by the vanished author. Sometimes agitation visited. Sometimes calm. Hours passed without speech. On other days, a handful of words surfaced, cut loose from context. The philosopher of affirmation, the man who taught the yes to life, no longer owned language. What remained was breath, pulse, the rhythm of survival. It is tempting to call this a refutation of his philosophy. It was not. It was simply another fate, and fate does not argue. When Franziska died, the scene changed. Weimar, Villa Silberblick, the archive. His sister, Elizabeth, curated the myth while her brother sat nearby like a saint already canonized. She opened doors to artists, writers, the curious, the powerful. They entered a bright room and saw him, silent, distant, uncomprehending, and each projected onto his face whatever they brought with them, awe, pity, unease, triumph. The man had become a mirror. The archive collected manuscripts, letters, notebooks, raw or from which posterity would forge meanings. But it also staged a theater. The philosopher is relic, the relic is proof. Between reverence and manipulation lay only a thin line, and it was crossed more than once. Years folded in on themselves. He suffered strokes that took parts of his body the way the silence had taken his words. Hands that had written Zarathustra no longer obeyed. Feet that had walked the Engadine paths no longer carried him. Still he lived, a presence in a chair, a figure at a window, a breathing contradiction to every grand narrative about strength and will. The end, when it came in 1900, was quiet. Pneumonia, exhaustion, a final stroke, the body consenting to what the mind had already conceded. They carried him back to Rockin. In the churchyard where his father lay, the circle closed, pastor and son, faith and its fiercest critic, side by side beneath the soil. What remains of a life when its voice has fallen silent? Not the body. Not the room. Not even the legend of the horse. What remains is the pressure of ideas on the living, a set of demands, a style of courage, a challenge that refuses to die. Nietzsche's last doctrine was not written. It was enacted. That thought, once released, no longer belongs to its author. There is an ethical discomfort in looking at these final years. To approach the silent figure is to feel the temptation to explain, to turn illness into metaphor, to make collapse serve a thesis. Nietzsche himself warned against such consolations. He asked that we look without flinching, at suffering, at decay, at our own need to make meaning where there may be none. So let us keep the frame narrow. A day in Weimar, morning light across the floorboards, attendants moving with practiced care, a book opened and closed without being read, a fragment of melody hummed and forgotten. Afternoon visitors, their footsteps soft, eyes lowered. On the table, notebooks no longer in use. On the wall, a portrait that resembles and fails to resemble the man in the chair. Evening shadows returning the room to quiet. Outside, the world began to change. New readers discovered his earlier books and felt the shock he had intended. A few sensed that the silence in Weimar was not an argument against him but a measure of the cost he had paid. Others, less scrupulous, saw an opportunity. A thinker unable to protest could be made to say anything. The archive's edits, arrangements, and omissions seeded decades of confusion. It is easy to forget how little success he saw while conscious. Sales were poor. Reviews were hostile or indifferent. The future he claimed as his audience had not yet arrived. In this sense, the silence after 1889 was an extension of the solitude that marked his life. He had written for ears that did not yet exist. Now even the possibility of hearing had been removed. And yet, those ears would arrive. The 20th century would come, and with it, crises on a scale that made his warnings feel prophetic. But that belongs to another chapter. Here, at the edge of 1900, what stands before us is not the future but the fact. A thinker who pushed himself past the limits of endurance, a family that tried to hold him together, a sister who turned care into power, and a room where a great voice faded into breath. Death was not his defeat. Death was simply the point at which the work detached from the worker. After Rockin, after the grave, the sentences continued to move, from hand to hand, from language to language, from century to century. The body ended, the challenge began. If you want to know the measure of his courage, do not look at how he lived when he was strong. Look at the risk he took when he wrote as if no one would understand him, and at the fact that, in the end, he wrote anyway. From here, the story will leave the quiet rooms of Naumburg and Weimar and step into a louder arena, misreadings, appropriations, distortions, and at last, the careful restorations that recovered his voice from the archive's shadow. But that is the next part of the journey. For now, the door closes, the room is dark, and the silence holds. The man is gone. The question remains. The image of Nietzsche's last decade is difficult to hold. On the one hand, it is a story of collapse, of a brilliant mind reduced to silence, of a philosopher who could no longer speak. On the other, it is the story of a presence that refused to disappear. Even in his broken state, Nietzsche became a symbol, a figure whose very silence invited interpretation. Visitors to Weimar described contradictory impressions. Some saw only tragedy, a genius destroyed, a warning against excess. Others claimed to see a strange serenity, as if the man who once declared war on pity had at last been delivered into peace. Elizabeth encouraged these views, shaping her brother's image according to the story she wanted to tell. For her, he was both prophet and martyr, proof of ideas she herself supported. The truth was simpler and harder. He was a human being in decline, no longer able to resist the uses others made of him. The irony is sharp. Nietzsche spent his life tearing masks away from culture, showing how ideals concealed instinct, how morality was often resentment in disguise. And in death, his own face became a mask, worn by causes he would have despised. But there is another way to read these years. Instead of tragedy or irony, we can see them as testimony to the endurance of thought. Nietzsche had always insisted that his audience was still to come. He had written for the future, and the future would answer. His collapse did not end that promise, it sealed it. The words already existed, scattered through books and fragments, waiting for readers bold enough to take them seriously. By the time Nietzsche's body was lowered into the earth at Rocken in August 1900, his work had already begun its second life. Friends kept publishing, translators carried his sentences into new languages, critics argued, admirers copied passages into notebooks. The man was gone. The voice was multiplying. And so chapter 6 in this video closes not in despair, but in transformation. The silence of his final years was real, but it was not the last word. Out of that silence, a new century would hear echoes that could not be ignored. When Nietzsche died in 1900, only a small circle knew his name. His books had sold poorly, his reputation was marginal, his voice seemed destined to vanish in the flood of a new century. And yet, within a few decades, his words would ignite movements, inspire artists, terrify politicians, and provoke generations of thinkers. His silence had ended, his legacy had begun. The first custodian of that legacy was his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche. She had returned from Paraguay after the death of her husband, the fanatic nationalist Bernhard Forster, and installed herself as guardian of the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar. Visitors came to Villa Silberblick to see both the silent philosopher and the collection of his manuscripts. Elizabeth welcomed them, guided them, and shaped their impressions. But she also shaped his writings. In 1901, she published The Will to Power, a book assembled from fragments of Nietzsche's notebooks. She presented it as his magnum opus, the grand system he had been working toward. In truth, Nietzsche had never finished such a work. The text was heavily edited, rearranged, even falsified. Passages were omitted, context shifted, themes exaggerated. Through Elizabeth's version, Nietzsche appeared as a prophet of power, nationalism, even authoritarianism, ideas he had in fact despised. The distortion would have catastrophic consequences. In the early 20th century, Nietzsche's fame spread quickly. Artists and writers felt his energy. Expressionist painters, modernist poets, dramatists of the absurd, all drew on his call to destroy idols and create new values. Sigmund Freud acknowledged him as a precursor in psychology. Rainer Maria Rilke, Thomas Mann, and countless others found in Nietzsche a voice that captured the anxiety of modern life. Yet as his influence grew, so did misinterpretation. His concept of the Übermensch was twisted into a racial ideal. His rejection of nationalism was ignored in favor of a caricature of strength. His aphorisms, torn from context, became slogans for those who sought domination rather than freedom. The darkest misuse came in the 1930s. The Nazi regime claimed Nietzsche as a prophet of their cause. Hitler himself visited Elizabeth in Weimar, where she staged the archive as a shrine of nationalist power. Photographs show him gazing at Nietzsche's bust, as if claiming inheritance. Passages about strength and will were cherry-picked, while Nietzsche's contempt for anti-Semitism and German nationalism was silenced. For a time, Nietzsche's name was stained by this association. Many dismissed him as a proto-fascist, a thinker who had paved the way for dictatorship. His reputation suffered, especially after the horrors of World War II. But careful scholarship later revealed the truth. The Nazis had relied on Elizabeth's falsified editions. When Nietzsche's real writings were restored, the distortions fell apart. He had despised anti-Semitism, mock nationalism, and condemned herd mentalities of every kind. He was not their prophet, he was their enemy. Meanwhile, philosophers in the mid-20th century rediscovered Nietzsche as a thinker of liberation. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus drew on his analysis of nihilism. Martin Heidegger devoted entire lecture series to him, calling him the last metaphysician and the first post-metaphysician. Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida developed entire methods of thought inspired by his suspicion of truth and his genealogical method. Beyond philosophy, Nietzsche shaped culture at every level. Psychologists explored his insights into resentment and power. Poets borrowed his rhythms. Musicians set his words to symphonies. Even popular culture echoed with fragments. "What does not kill me makes me stronger" became a cliché, repeated by athletes, soldiers, and motivational speakers, often without knowing the depths of its origin. By the late 20th century, Nietzsche had become both revered and feared. He was quoted by revolutionaries and conservatives, by artists and tyrants, by those who sought freedom and those who sought control. Few thinkers had been so widely appropriated, so misunderstood, so debated. This was the paradox of his legacy. Nietzsche had warned that his ideas would be dangerous, that they could be twisted into poison as easily as medicine. He once wrote, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." Dynamite can illuminate, or it can destroy. And yet, beneath all distortions, the core of his thought continued to burn. The death of God, the challenge of nihilism, the demand for self-overcoming, these themes proved prophetic in an age of war, technological upheaval, and cultural fragmentation. Nietzsche spoke to the modern condition more directly than any of his contemporaries. By the end of the 20th century, Nietzsche had become unavoidable. To study philosophy without him was impossible. His influence stretched from theology to literature, from psychology to political theory. Even those who opposed him had to define themselves against him. The story of Nietzsche in the 20th century is therefore a story of misuse and recovery, distortion and rediscovery. His sister turned him into a nationalist prophet. The Nazis turned him into a weapon of propaganda. But scholars and readers turned back to the texts themselves and found a thinker of nuance, irony, and radical courage. What emerges from this history is not a simple figure. Nietzsche is not safe. He is not a banner for one cause. He remains what he always was, a challenge, a provocation, a thinker who demands that each reader decide what it means to live without absolutes. By the dawn of the 21st century, Nietzsche's shadow stretched across the entire intellectual landscape. He was quoted in classrooms, debated in cafes, echoed in novels, invoked in therapy, and argued over in politics. His ideas had entered the bloodstream of culture. And yet, he remained untamed. The distortions never fully disappeared, and perhaps they never will. For Nietzsche wrote in a style that resists closure, a style of fragments, of provocations, of masks. He gave us not a doctrine but a set of weapons, and weapons can be used in many ways. The silence of Weimar ended with death. But the echo of Nietzsche's voice only grew louder with each decade. Misused, reinterpreted, celebrated, condemned, his thought refused to rest. In this, his prophecy was fulfilled. He had written for an audience that did not yet exist. That audience was the 20th century, and beyond. Nietzsche's influence after his death was like a river splitting into many currents. Some ran clear, others turned dark, but all carried traces of his fire. In the years after World War II, Europe was haunted by ruins, physical ruins, moral ruins, the collapse of certainties. It was in this landscape that Nietzsche's warnings about nihilism rang with terrifying clarity. If God was dead, if the old values were broken, what could replace them? The question was no longer abstract philosophy. It was history itself. The existentialists were the first to take up the challenge. Jean-Paul Sartre, writing in the cafés of occupied Paris, declared that man is condemned to be free. Camus, facing the absurd, imagined Sisyphus pushing his boulder without illusion. Both drew from Nietzsche's insistence that life has no given meaning, that meaning must be created in defiance of despair. For Sartre, Nietzsche's cry of freedom became a demand for responsibility. In a godless world, every choice is ours, and with it, every burden. For Camus, Nietzsche's laughter in the face of tragedy became a model of revolt, to say yes to life, even when it offers no justification. Meanwhile, Martin Heidegger devoted entire lecture series to Nietzsche. He saw him not simply as a critic of values, but as the culmination of Western metaphysics. To Heidegger, Nietzsche revealed the secret of philosophy itself, that beneath every system lies the will to power. For Heidegger, Nietzsche was both the end of an era and the opening to a new one. Later, postmodern thinkers carried Nietzsche's suspicion of truth into their own methods. Michel Foucault took inspiration from Nietzsche's genealogies, unmasking prisons, clinics, and schools as systems of power disguised as reason. Jacques Derrida turned Nietzsche's play of language into deconstruction, showing that every text carries contradictions within itself. Without Nietzsche, these movements would not have taken shape. But Nietzsche did not only echo in philosophy. Artists and writers across the century carried his voice into new forms. Franz Kafka's stories of alienation and absurd authority read like parables of the world after God's death. Thomas Mann portrayed Nietzschean figures torn between creation and destruction. Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf imagined a man split by instincts, haunted by the possibility of transformation. In music, Gustav Mahler, Richard Strauss, and later modernists wove Nietzschean texts into their compositions. Strauss set passages from Zarathustra to music in his tone poem Also Sprach Zarathustra, later immortalized in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey. Nietzsche's words, once ignored, now thundered in concert halls and cinemas. In psychology, Freud and Jung both felt his presence. Freud's analysis of repression and instinct echoed Nietzsche's suspicion that morality masked hidden drives. Jung, more sympathetic, saw in Nietzsche's Zarathustra a mythic confrontation with the unconscious. Entire schools of depth psychology would later treat Nietzsche not as a philosopher, but as a case study and a guide. Even popular culture absorbed fragments of him. The phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," spread far beyond philosophy, repeated by athletes, soldiers, and pop stars. Stripped of its context, it became cliché, but even in cliché, it testified to the persistence of his thought. The danger Nietzsche foresaw was realized. His words became masks, picked up by whoever needed them. Tyrants quoted him, revolutionaries quoted him, advertisers quoted him. His voice could inspire or corrupt, liberate or seduce. And yet, this too was Nietzsche's prophecy. He knew that once unleashed, his ideas could not be controlled. He wrote not for disciples but for experimenters, not for a system but for a future that would test him. He demanded that readers become strong enough to use him, and then to outgrow him. By the end of the 20th century, Nietzsche was everywhere, in philosophy departments and art studios, in psychology seminars and concert halls, in political speeches and pop slogans. Few thinkers had spread so far, so fast, into so many domains. What united these echoes was not agreement, but confrontation. Nietzsche was not a doctrine to be followed. He was a challenge to be faced. To read him was to risk being changed, or to risk misusing him. The line was always thin. Thus, Nietzsche's legacy is not a single story but a battlefield of interpretations. He was the prophet of strength, the critic of weakness, the herald of freedom, the victim of distortion. He was dynamite, and the explosions are still being measured. As the century turned, one thing was certain: Nietzsche had been right about one thing above all: his true audience was not his own time. It was US.to grasp Nietzsche's legacy, one must accept its contradictions. He was used to justify tyranny and to inspire liberation. He was claimed by the powerful and by the powerless, by the defenders of tradition and by those who sought to shatter it. Few thinkers have been so violently torn apart by interpretation. And yet, perhaps this is fitting. For Nietzsche himself rejected the idea of a single truth, a single system, a single meaning. He believed that life itself was multiplicity, struggle, interpretation. That his own work became a battlefield was not a failure, it was proof of its vitality. The danger of Nietzsche is also his gift. He cannot be reduced to a slogan, though many have tried. He cannot be caged by ideology, though many have forced him into one. His words burn through the masks placed upon them again and again, demanding new readers, new contexts, new courage. By the end of the 20th century, one thing was clear: Nietzsche had become the philosopher of crisis. In every moment when foundations cracked, his voice returned. In art, in politics, in psychology, in philosophy, he remained the thinker who asked, "What will you do when the old gods are gone?" This is the thread that runs through every misuse, every rediscovery, every interpretation. Nietzsche forces confrontation. He leaves no one untouched. And in this way, his prophecy was fulfilled. He wrote not for his time, but for ours, and for every time when certainty collapses. Friedrich Nietzsche's life ended in silence. But his voice, the voice of his books, his aphorisms, his visions, has never ceased to echo. To understand him is not simply to trace his biography. It is to stand before the core of his thought, to feel the force of ideas that remain as dangerous now as they were then. The first and most infamous, the death of God. When Nietzsche wrote, "God is dead," he was not speaking of a deity struck down in a single moment. He meant that the old faith, the Christian worldview that had structured Europe for centuries, had lost its binding power. Science, history, and critical reason had dissolved belief. The heavens were empty. The ground of morality was gone. But for Nietzsche, this was not triumph. It was catastrophe. With the death of God came nihilism, the collapse of all meaning, the realization that values had no foundation. He warned, "We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." And in the wake of this death, humanity stood at a crossroads, either sink into despair or create new values from the earth itself. This leads to Nietzsche's second theme, nihilism. For him, nihilism was not merely the absence of belief. It was the sickness of a culture that no longer knew why it lived. He diagnosed modern Europe as hollow, filled with moral habits that had lost their roots. Christianity still spoke of good and evil, but its voice was hollow. Secular ideologies repeated its tone, but without its soul. Nihilism was not only a danger, it was also a possibility. For in the clearing left by the death of God, humanity could face itself honestly for the first time. What we do with that clearing, Nietzsche believed, would decide the future. His answer was the vision of the Übermensch, the Overman. Often misunderstood, twisted into caricature, the Übermensch is not a racial ideal, nor a tyrant of strength. It is a symbol, a figure of self-overcoming. Humanity, Nietzsche said, is the rope stretched between beast and creator, a bridge and not a goal. The Übermensch is the one who crosses the bridge, who dares to create values in the absence of absolutes, who affirms life instead of waiting for salvation. Zarathustra speaks, "Man is something that shall be overcome." What have you done to overcome him? It is a challenge to every reader. The Übermensch is not given. It is demanded. But to test this affirmation, Nietzsche posed a riddle, the eternal recurrence. Imagine, he said, that a demon whispered to you, "This life, with all its pains and joys, all its humiliations and triumphs, must return eternally, exactly as it is, again and again, forever." Would you collapse in despair? Or would you embrace it, say yes to it, love it so completely that you would will its return? For Nietzsche, eternal recurrence was not a cosmological theory but an existential experiment. It was the heaviest weight. Could you affirm life so deeply that you would choose it eternally? To pass this test is to reach the highest form of affirmation, the true yes to existence. Beneath these doctrines lies Nietzsche's deepest insight, the will to power. For him, life is not primarily about survival or even about happiness. Life is a struggle of forces, an overflowing, an expansion of strength. The will to power is not only political dominance, it is the drive of every organism to grow, to express, to overcome. Art, philosophy, science, morality, all are forms of the will to power. Even pity, even weakness, are strategies of power, hidden maneuvers in the great play of forces. Nietzsche saw the world not as a structure of laws, but as a dance of energies, ceaselessly striving, colliding, creating. To live is to join this dance, not to escape it. Finally, Nietzsche shattered the illusion of absolute truth through perspectivism. There are no facts, he wrote, only interpretations. This does not mean that reality is an illusion. It means that we always see from a perspective, from a position of life. Truth itself is bound to perspective. To seek a view from nowhere is to seek nothingness. Perspectivism demands honesty. Every philosophy, every morality, every belief is an expression of a perspective of the world that produced it. The question is not whether truth exists, but who speaks it and what life it serves. Taken together, these ideas form Nietzsche's challenge. To live without absolutes. To affirm life in the face of suffering. To create meaning where none is given. To see truth as perspective and perspective as power. He gave no system, no commandments. He gave provocations, questions, lightning bolts. He wrote for readers willing to risk themselves, willing to confront despair without illusion. And what of the end? What of the silence in Weimar, the broken figure in the archive? It is tempting to read tragedy into it, to see Nietzsche's collapse as proof of the dangers he announced. But the truth is simpler. The man ended. The thought remained. The silence was his final gift. That philosophy is larger than the philosopher, that once released, ideas live lives of their own. So what is Nietzsche's final message? Not consolation. Not peace. His message is a wound, an open question. What do you do when the old gods are gone? What do you affirm when no one gives you meaning? Can you say yes, not just to pleasure, but to pain, to loss, to the eternal recurrence of your life? Nietzsche's voice ends here, in silence. But the echo is yours. Nietzsche's phrase "God is dead" is so often quoted that its weight is almost forgotten. It was not a celebration. It was not a slogan. It was a diagnosis, spoken like the tolling of a bell. The words echo through the gay science, in the mouth of a madman who runs through the marketplace with a lantern, crying out that God is dead and we have killed him. The people laugh at him, they do not yet understand what he means. The madman continues, "What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down?" This was Nietzsche's point. Without God, without a transcendent anchor, the very compass of human life spins without direction. The catastrophe is not the loss of belief in one figure, but the collapse of an entire horizon of meaning. For Nietzsche, this catastrophe was both terrifying and exhilarating. On one hand, it exposed humanity to the abyss of nihilism, the sense that life has no purpose, that every value is arbitrary, that nothing matters. On the other, it forced humanity into adulthood. If no eternal truth exists, then meaning is no longer received. It must be created. Nihilism, in his eyes, was the critical point in history. He distinguished between two forms, passive nihilism and active nihilism. Passive nihilism is resignation, the slow decay of a culture that no longer believes in itself, where people cling to old habits, knowing they are hollow. Active nihilism is destructive energy, the willingness to tear down idols, to face the void directly, to risk creating something new. Nietzsche despised the first and embraced the second. He wanted to ignite the fire that would burn away illusions, leaving space for creation. And yet, he knew how dangerous this was. Most people would prefer the comfort of passive nihilism, drifting in repetition, hiding behind borrowed values. Few would dare the storm of active nihilism, where every certainty collapses and one must stand alone. This is why Nietzsche's words strike with such urgency. They are not mere description. They are a summons. He is calling his readers to recognize the death of God not as a piece of history, but as a personal challenge. To admit the void, to feel the vertigo of a world without absolutes, and then to decide despair or creation. The Übermensch is often treated as Nietzsche's most dangerous word. It was twisted by ideologues, misunderstood by critics, and reduced to caricature. But to Nietzsche, it was never about blood or race, never about conquest in the political sense. It was about creation. The Übermensch is the figure who dares to step beyond inherited values, who forges meaning where none is given. He is not a ruler of others, he is a ruler of himself. His power is not domination, but self-overcoming. Nietzsche once described humanity as the rope stretched between beast and creator. That rope trembles over an abyss. On one side, the past, instinct, herd, comfort. On the other, the possibility of transformation. The Übermensch is the one who does not cling to the rope, but crosses it, accepting the danger of the fall for the chance of creation. Think of Zarathustra descending from the mountain to speak to humanity. He brings not commandments, but challenges. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? His words sting because they are not addressed to a nation or a class, but to you, the listener. The Übermensch is not an abstract ideal, it is a demand pressed into the soul of each reader. And this demand leads directly into Nietzsche's strangest, most unsettling thought, the eternal recurrence. Imagine, every moment you live will return eternally, exactly as it is, with no variation, no escape. Every joy, every humiliation, every pain. Would you curse the demon who told you this, collapse in despair, call the thought unbearable? Or could you embrace it? Could you love life so fiercely that you would will its repetition forever? This is Nietzsche's ultimate test. To say yes to eternal recurrence is to affirm life at its most extreme, not only the pleasures, but the wounds, the betrayals, the grief. To say yes even to suffering, even to loss, is to stand at the highest point of affirmation. The eternal recurrence was never meant as proof of cosmology. Nietzsche was not asking you to calculate the physics of infinite time. It was an experiment in thought, a mirror held up to your existence. Can you embrace your life so fully that you would will it again, endlessly, eternally? Few can. But in that confrontation, you glimpse Nietzsche's demand, not a comforting philosophy, but a philosophy that wounds and awakens. The Übermensch and the eternal recurrence are two sides of the same challenge. One calls you to overcome, the other tests whether your affirmation is real. Beneath all of Nietzsche's words runs a single current, the will to power. It is easy to misunderstand. Some hear only the echo of politics, of domination, of violence. But Nietzsche meant something deeper. The will to power is the pulse of life itself, the surge to expand, to grow, to express, to overcome. Every instinct, every act, every thought carries this drive. Art is will to power shaped into beauty. Science is will to power seeking knowledge. Even pity, even weakness, are strategies of power, ways of survival, maneuvers in the endless play of forces. Nietzsche saw the world not as a clockwork mechanism of laws, but as a storm of energies, colliding, colluding, creating. To live fully is not to escape the storm, but to embrace it, to let one's own will sing in harmony, or clash and struggle, with the will of others. This vision stripped away illusions of neutrality. There is no pure truth outside of life, no view from nowhere. Which brings us to his last, most unsettling insight, perspectivism. There are no facts, Nietzsche declared, only interpretations. He did not mean that reality is fiction, or that nothing is real. He meant that reality is always seen from somewhere, always filtered through a perspective, always tied to the life that looks. Every philosophy is an interpretation. Every morality is a mask for instincts. Every truth is spoken by someone, from somewhere, for some purpose. To forget this is to fall back into illusion. To remember it is to see that truth itself is bound to the wool that creates it. Perspectivism does not destroy truth. It demands honesty about it. It asks, whose truth is this? What life does it serve? What power does it express? Taken together, the death of God, nihilism, the Übermensch, eternal recurrence, the will to power, perspectivism, these are not a system. They are a challenge, a provocation, a call. Nietzsche never gave commandments. He gave lightning. He left wounds that forced the soul to respond. And what of the end? The silent man in Weimar, the shattered philosopher in the archive? His collapse tempts us to see tragedy, proof that no one can carry the fire without being consumed. But perhaps the truth is different. The man ended. The thought remained. The silence itself became testimony that philosophy, once released, lives beyond the body that bore it. So what remains here at the close? Not consolation, not peace. Nietzsche's message is a question pressed into the heart. What do you do when the old gods are gone? What do you affirm when no one gives you meaning? Can you say yes, not just to pleasure, but to pain, to loss, to the eternal return of your life? Nietzsche's voice ended in silence. But the echo is yours. The words are finished, the voice is gone. Only silence remains. But silence is not the end, it is a mirror, and what you see in it is yourself. Nietzsche's question lingers, what do you affirm when nothing is given? Can you say yes to life, to pain, to eternity? The book is closed, the echo remains.
In the end, Nietzsche's life became both a warning and a prophecy. He fell silent, but his words never did. And if you made it this far, well, perhaps you're as mad as he was. Good night.